Hello, everybody. Whoa, come on. Just doesn't do it. Oh, now it's done it. There we go. Hi. Look, thanks for coming. I know. Hasn't it been an incredible day? I mean, just well, I think the positive vibes in the room. I've learned so much. It's been really, really full of energy, and I hope you agree with me there. And today I'll just tell you what I'm going to do, what I'm planning to do. Hopefully I'm not going to go off script, but except now my thing is going crazy. Let me just do this again. Nope. Come on. Nope. There we go. Great. I'll tell you what we're planning to do. I thought that I would just talk for about half an hour about some ideas about creating rape-free worlds based on a new book. I hope you've all got the old book, because I'd rather you get the old book so that when the new book comes out in June, you can get that as well, on rape-free worlds. And I mean, this new book, which again is coming out in June, is a global reflections on sexual violence. And so, of course, in that context, when we're thinking about, well, on a global level, what can we do? What is the way forward? I think is really, really interesting, and I hope you will agree with me. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes. But then what I really want is to hear your reflections of what you think we ought to all be doing to create a world where we don't have survivors. And that's sort of what the whole plan is about. And to be really brutal about it, that's what this whole conference, I keep calling it conference, this whole festival is about. But I want to start by saying that, if you're like me, the last few hours, it kind of sometimes felt a bit bombarded by really grim stories and grim statistics and surveys. So what I wanted this session to do was just to make a really basic point, and that is, it doesn't have to be this way. The world we have created, we can uncreate it, we can recreate it. But first, I'm going to get depressed just for a couple of minutes. Some of you who are in the opening session, I love statistics, so I'm going to just give you some of them, because there are some depressing statistics that we do need to think about. A few years ago, I wrote a history of rape. And in writing that history, I found myself becoming emotionally just enraged in a way I wasn't anticipating. I really wasn't anticipating that, because I'm kind of calm, cool person. And for me personally, the statistic that did it for me was the one that showed me that actually things have gotten worse. And that was what enraged me when I was doing that book. So, what I discovered was, in the 1970s, some of you weren't alive then, but in the 1970s, for every case that gets reported to the police, every case of rape that gets reported to the police, 1 in 3 ended in a conviction. That's 1970s, 1 in 3. 1980s, 1 in 5. 1990s, 1 in 10. 2000s, 1 in 20. Today, 3%. And that statistic, just think about that, because this is after 40 years of feminism, 40 years of really, really, really good, in my view, legal reform, and 40 years of education. So that was what really enraged me. And of course, these are real underestimates. These are cases that get reported to the police, okay? We know that so many never get that far. 90% never get that far. And so for me, this was damning evidence that something was really, really terribly wrong, and rape, in fact, had been decriminalized. But in that earlier book, I made the argument, but okay, I made an optimistic argument, which I'm going to be making today. And that is that, rapists, people who assault other people, are not born, they are made. In other words, they make choices. And if they can make these choices, they can unmake those choices. And that kind of gave me a little hope, because it meant that we can imagine different worlds in which different choices are being made. And that was important. Now, I lured you into this room promising optimism. And it doesn't look like I'm doing too well so far. My mother taught me never to lie, and I always obey my mother. So here it is. I am not delusional, I am not naive, I'm not stupid, I'm not a liar. But I still honestly believe that we can create rape-free worlds. After all, to be human is to seek companionship. It is to seek friendship. It is to seek love. Now, of course, just because I'm not delusional, naive, stupid, or a liar, nor am I, as some of my friends may disagree with this, by the way, nor am I utopian by disposition. So I am going to have to admit that it's not going to be easy. The main problem, I think, that we have is this really debilitating myth. And the debilitating myth I'm talking about is the myth that sexual violence is inevitable. It's kind of deeply wired, in kind of evolutionary terms, in sort of male sexuality, or it's culturally omnipresent. Now, there is so much evidence against those two propositions. I mean, and I do that in the other books, so much evidence. However, the fact that it's time and again, people tell me these things, it's inevitable because da-da-da-da-da-da, that, you know, we need to at least try to break down that view. And I think there are two ways I'm just going to mention very, very briefly here. We can talk about it later. But okay, two contexts. First, armed conflicts. We all know that sexual violence is very high in armed conflicts. But what's really interesting for me is if we look historically and if we look in terms of different conflicts, that in fact there's extremely wide variation in armed conflicts in the degree and extent of sexual violence. In fact, in some military conflicts, there's relatively little sexual violence. Secondly, in peacetime context, we can also see that it's not the case that all societies have high levels of rape that we have, for example, in this country and in many other countries in the world. So a lot of anthropologists, for example, have drawn attention to entire societies which are rape-free or have extremely low levels of sexual violence, or in which sexual violence is really highly stigmatized. These are communities in North and South America, Oceania, Asia, and Africa, where rape is very, very rare in these small communities. It's regarded as a shameful act that puts a man's virility and his humanity in question. Now, I know there's problems with this research, and any of you who've had anthropologists in this room know that there are problems with this research. Primarily small sample sizes, and they are mainly basing their research, their findings, on very small communities, particularly tribal and band communities. But I do think we should just remind ourselves that ignoring totally the low levels of sexual violence in these societies does actually naturalize Western practices and experiences of rape. But all of the research, literally all of the research, suggests the fact that rape thrives in situations of economic and structural inequality. So what we find is that societies with low levels of militarization, high female economic power, and high levels of sexual equality are characteristically societies which have low levels of sexual violence. In other words, sexual violence is fomented within contexts of inequalities, unequal societies and militaristic societies. Okay, so what shall we do? Well, effective solutions to high levels of sexual violence are difficult to pinpoint, but I'd like to suggest that this is not because there are no positive ways forward, but the actual opposite of that. In other words, the strategies open to us are legion. The awe-inspiring, creative diversity of human existence offers an exhilarating range of options for anti-rape activists if we demonstrate a keenness to learn and a willingness to listen. Crucially, the tasks of task of imagining, thinking, planning, and acting on forging rape-free worlds requires us to pay attention to our local contexts within global frames of frameworks, global frames. So economic frames, ideological and political frames. My point is that the cumulative effect of local change is global transformation. So again, what can be done? My new book, Disgrace, published by Reaction Books in June next year, doesn't, and this is actually quite important for me, doesn't attempt to prescribe what strategies activists should adopt. After all, as you'll see, I'm actually extremely hostile to universalist approaches. Rather, I aim to suggest a milieu within which effective activism might emerge. Now, because my emphasis is on local specificities within global frames of vision, it's inevitable that my talk is going to draw upon my own personal, localized position, as well as my political identification as a socialist feminist. And this, you'll see why this is important later in my talk. So in other words, my worldview is fundamentally shaped by my whiteness, cisgender, and the fact that I grew up, my childhood was in New Zealand, Zambia, Solomon Islands, and most importantly, and for most of my childhood, Haiti. And this is really important in terms of where I am positioning myself, where I'm positioned. These early, historically and geographically specific frames have also, of course, been molded by other people, material objects, and localities. And again, particularly if we're talking about my adulthood, Britain, and of course, well, not of course, and Greece, which is where I spent half of my life. Now, these contexts have made me profoundly skeptical about the commitment and capacity of criminal justice systems to effectively challenge rape, pervasive rape cultures. This is, of course, not to deny that legal and other legislative initiatives are crucial, particularly in drawing public attention to the extent and the seriousness of sexual violence. The law is also, I think, really effective in establishing officially agreed norms of behavior. And here I'm thinking, for example, law's been really great in establishing marital rape is rape. It's been quite, okay, mixed but quite good that employers cannot, should not, it's wrong to discriminate or to harass employees. However, it fails, I think, to address or to dent pervasive assumptions of male entitlement. Relying on the penal state to enforce good behavior also does incredible harm. Ironically, carceral forms of rape, of anti-rape feminism may dramatically increase the levels of sexual assault, especially as suffered by boys, men, and non-binary genders within prison. So you take it from outside prison, you put it within prison. Also, no one, I don't think anyone, seriously believes that deterrence works. Sexually aggressive men, firstly, they don't think what they're doing is wrong. Secondly, they don't think they're going to be caught. And they're probably right, in fact, as the statistics I mentioned at the beginning. The idea that prison sentences can rehabilitate sexual offenders has repeatedly been debunked. Indeed, in most prisons worldwide, wardens don't even make a pretext of, deterrence or rehabilitation. It's more plausible, I think, to argue that incarcerating sexual offenders boosts their anger and may even brutalize them much further. Equally germane, of course, is the fact that retributive justice disproportionately targets people of color and minoritized people, other minoritized people, such as the poor, the mentally ill, and those who belong to gender minorities. So in other words, exchanging sexist oppression for racist oppression is no solution. I also can't summon enthusiasm for palliative solutions to sexual violence. Now, clearly, we're all here. We're all here because we believe in providing access, improving access dramatically to survivors of sexual violence, providing them with shelter, counseling, legal advice, long-term mechanisms for day-to-day flourishing. These are absolutely crucial, but they still leave the fundamental problem, abusive men, intact. They may unwittingly bolster victim-blaming sentiments, requiring people who are at risk of assault to police their own behavior is damaging at best, and advising girls and women to stay at home is equally unhelpful. I mean, we all know that household survival depends upon out to work. And anyway, domestic spaces are packed with abusers anyway. So, in other words, to create rape-free worlds, we need to think about more radical labor. And I've taken inspiration from feminists battling sexual violence in contexts where inequalities and multiple oppressions are particularly stark, thus demanding urgent and deeply rooted action. So they're kind of situated knowledges. That's a term by philosopher Donna Haraway. They're situated knowledges incite, I think, inventive ways of thinking about anti-rape activism. Sociologist Chandra Mohanty even maintains that in developing both theoretical knowledge and revolutionary practices, marginalized communities possess an advantage over more privileged ones. So her point is that, in her words, the lives, experiences, and struggles of girls and women of the two-thirds world demystify capitalism in its racial and sexual dimensions. And this provides productive and essential avenues of theorizing and enacting capitalist resistance. Now, part of the reason that both Mohanty and Haraway and myself believe that activists must pay attention to the situated knowledges of subjected peoples is because we are committed to the view that all forms of tyranny are interlinked. It will never be enough for activists to work along only one dimension of oppression, misogyny, for example, because systems of domination are multi-layered and co-constituted. Abuse is not a discrete, singular affair. In order to effectively tackle rape, it's important to recognize that sexual violence is not only political, it's not solely personal, and it's not even specifically a tool of gendered oppression. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that because sexual violence cannot be detached from other political, economic, socio-cultural inequalities, attempts to eradicate it will require activists to move away their attention from individual perpetrators and survivors towards systemic injustices. And, everyone in this room can add their list to the one I'm going to give you. Systemic injustices fueled by sexism, racism, colonialism, economic injustice, heteronormativity, transphobia, militarism, climate denial, and neoliberal capitalisms. And you can all add your list to that short list. In other words, campaigns against gendered violence cannot exist, thrive, or transform the world without alliances with other progressive causes. So what this means is that effective movements against gender violence needs to celebrate difference, even though this will inevitably lead to disagreements and dissent within activist movements. And I'm going to be elaborating on this point in the last section of this talk, drawing on the concept of transversalism. So think universalism and then think transversalism. However, before returning to this overall premise for effective resistance, I'm going to briefly discuss 4 other ways forward. And these are locality, diversity, pleasure, the body. So that's locality, diversity, pleasure, and the body. So first, anti-rape strategies must attend to local needs and engage the political labor of local activists. It cannot be outsourced or directed by others. This will require paying attention to micro practices of resistance carried out by minoritized peoples who may lack access to prominent speaking platforms and global media. Crucially, these small, localized movements are not simply pockets of proto-resistance, just sort of sitting there waiting to be discovered, noticed, enhanced, developed by one of the many authorized feminisms. They are a vital component of the global movement to create a rape-free world. And in this, I have been inspired on a personal level by Haitian feminists, organizations such as Haitians Against Violence at Home, Solidarité Femmes Haïtiennes, Que Femmes, Droit Femmes, who all are engaged in this kind of grassroots activism, educational campaigns in particular. In the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake, for example, the grassroots work done by these groups was vital in helping women and their families to endure the catastrophe. While foreign NGOs, we're talking now about those outsiders who come in, the foreign NGOs, multinational aid organizations, feminist groups squandered billions of dollars. While they did that, these local groups intervened in pragmatic ways. They encouraged girls and women to share their experiences of sexual violence. They organized security for women walking to and fro the toilets. They provided medical assistance and counseling, and they led protest marches. So, point here that is, you may say, well, in scale, this is tiny. In scale, their actions are small. In effect, they are literally, for those women, life-saving. Second, justice is not only locally relevant, but culturally variable. By necessity, anti-rape initiatives will be diverse. And I mean diverse in, there's a million ways you can mean it. I'm going to talk about two ways very briefly. First is in terms of personnel, and second in terms of strategy. First, they need to be inclusive in terms of personnel. Now, obviously, local will be, because by definition, local is diverse. But I want to add another thing to this, and this includes ensuring that anti-rape activism responds to the desires of many boys and men to be welcomed as co-workers in anti-rape movements. We just simply cannot afford to alienate any potential allies. In the final analysis, political attempts to reduce and finally eliminate sexual aggression must start with the main perpetrators, cisgendered men. Second, strategies for eradicate, and there was a fantastic session on this just before this one. I don't know if some of you I saw at it. Second, strategies for eradicating rape must also be, the strategies must also be diverse. In other words, there is no singular template. Now, this doesn't mean, however, that different feminist strategies, that different feminist strategies will be in conflict with each other. For example, anti-rape activism carried out by indigenous Indian women in the US may be incompatible with white, liberal, feminist ideals. As Native American gender scholar Sarah Deer explains, simply replicating the Anglo-American model will fail to address the unique nature and context of sexual violence as experienced by Native women. Indeed, she contends, white feminist ways of addressing violence may even exacerbate the rape crisis in their communities. Different communities also have very different priorities. While many feminists in the West may urge activists in the global South to focus on changes, they call them reforms, which I find really interesting, focus on changes to rape laws, this actually may not be the priority for indigenous women. Religion is another area of dissent for feminists in contesting rape in different parts of the world. Many secular feminists are hostile to religious interventions into sexual violence on the grounds that Judeo-Christian and Islamic values and practices have been pivotal to or to women-hating ideologies. But of course, this is viciously, violently, aggressively disputed by other feminists. Most obviously, Islamic feminism is a powerful force for good in anti-rape activisms throughout the world. So the first two tenets are locality and diversity. The third is the embrace of pleasure. Anti-rape activism, I don't need to tell anyone here, anti-rape activism is tiring. It's often depressing and demoralizing. That's kind of inevitable. But there are more positive and creative approaches that we can, and I think should, be adopting if girls, women, and other oppressed people are to be empowered. While not minimizing, I don't want to minimize the seriousness of the task ahead. After all, femicide is rife throughout the world. Nevertheless, anti-rape activism must be enticing, even seductive. Otherwise, we're just all going to get burnt out if it's to change people's hearts and minds. Activists are emboldened, and here, this is the wonderful festival where we can celebrate this. Activists, we are all emboldened by art, literature, poetry, film, performance theater, music. The poet Adrienne Rich has reflected on the importance of all forms of artistic expression, not as a privileged rendering of human suffering, but as a form of resistance, which totalizing systems want to quell. She insists that art and literature are capable of, and I love this, I love Adrienne Rich, so, okay, she insists that art and literature are capable of reaching into us for what is still passionate, still unintimidated, still unquenched. The former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher famously coined the phrase, "There is no alternative," to her neoliberal policies, which earned her the nickname Tina, "There is no alternative." However, Rich argues that the imagination's road opens before us, giving the lie to that brutal dictum, "There is no alternative." When poetry lays its hand on our shoulders, we are, to an almost physical degree, touched and moved. So Rich's claim that creative activism emotionally moves people, I think, is apposite. Activism is most effective when it is hands-on. The bodily presence of other people, survivors who share their stories, which we have heard today, is formidable. And this is, I think, exactly what this festival is a testament to. These four central themes in any transnational campaign against sexual violence, acknowledging locality, diversity, pleasure of the body, nestle within an overarching concept, transversalism. It draws on the Latin root trans, meaning to go beyond, to pass through. So transversalism means to pass through universalism. And this is what I want to turn to just in my final few statements. If we are to create rape-free worlds, we would need to harness the political, economic, cultural labor of all political groups. And this is not straightforward. Just because sexual violence, I think everyone here knows, is an unequivocal wrong, this doesn't mean it's going to be easy to talk to each other and to establish coalitions, strategies, divide us. Those radical feminists who believe that sexual violence is caused by the mass consumption of pornography by males are unlikely to be converted by sex-positive feminists like myself. Feminists, those who believe that the solution to prevent rape cultures is a return to family values, will not suddenly be persuaded by those of us who celebrate erotic liberation. Another example, the divide between the socialist lesbian feminists in the US and Cuban socialist feminists who marginalized homosexuality it's very difficult to bridge. the vigilantism that's necessary in so many parts of the world in order, with weak law enforcement systems, is repudiated by many feminists in the West, while the carceral feminism of many white feminists is, rightly in my view, just my view, deemed racist. Some believe that male anti-rape activists will distort anti-rape movements, draining resources from girls and women towards their politically dominant gender. Others, like myself, believe that the inclusion of all genders is indispensable for any radical transformation. My point is this: there is no universal standpoint, and we should just give it up. There's no universal standpoint upon which people who seek to eradicate sexual violence can agree. Knowledges are local and diverse. So, how is feminist solidarity going to be forged? As mentioned earlier, I found real inspiration in transversalism, the concept coined by activists in Bologna during the early 1990s, and they used it to get discussions going between Israeli feminists and Palestinian feminists. So the approach is interested in how people who regard each other as adversaries can come to a mutual understanding in the interests of a shared goal. And in the context of this festival, that shared goal is rape-free worlds. So transversalism starts from the basic belief that every person recognizes the world from their own position. That's why I told you where I was coming from, my position, okay? And that as a consequence, all knowledge is partial and incomplete. Naira Yuval Davis pleads for a shift from identity politics, who we are, to goal-orientated politics, what we want to achieve. This shift does not require activists to repudiate our self-identities, as if we could, after all. After all, even though all of our identities obviously are fluid, complex, we do nevertheless come freighted with personal histories, social and economic contexts, the effects of accidental as well as intentional encounters. Transversalism, though, requires activists to acknowledge our situated knowledges while eagerly responding to the knowledges of others. In other words, it involves acknowledging one's own intersectional position in historical time, which is called rooting, while paying attention to what matters to others, called shifting. In other words, others' thoughts, needs, and desires. In the words of feminist international legal scholar Hilary Charlesworth, each woman remains rooted in her own history and identity while shifting to understand the roots of other women in dialogue. Charlesworth explains that transversalism differs from universalism by allowing multiple points of departure rather than assuming that there is a universal bedrock of values in all societies. In other words, transversalism draws attention to the fact that universalism is nothing more than disguised ethnocentrism. The task of creating anti-rape coalitions requires the acceptance of difference, predicated on a recognition of the grounded positionalities of participants, strategically united by one goal, in this case, eradicating sexual violence. What this means is that feminists should abandon the pretext of a shared female identity in the interests of solidarity based on the acknowledgement of difference and disagreement. Indeed, I can make this claim even more strongly, recognizing that we each possess unfinished, situated knowledges is the very basis for successful coalitions. As cultural studies scholar Lynell Seacombe put it, it's not disagreement, resistance, and agitation that destroy community. It is rather the repression or suppression of difference and disagreement in the name of unity and consensus, which destroys the engagement and interrelation of the community. And this is well known to activists from minoritized communities. Bitter experience has exposed the fact that attempting to forge common ground favors the socially, economically, and politically dominant partners. because universalism, essentialism, and identity politics creates barriers to effective anti-rape activism or anti-rape coalitions, activists should abandon attempts to collaborate only with those like us. This is not to say we should cease to argue with our opponents, our feminist opponents, who share our goals but not necessarily our political approaches. Dissent is inherent in what it means to be a political person. In the interest of transnational solidarity, however, these arguments must be pursued separately and vigorously from the broader goals of establishing coalitions that focus on eradicating sexual violence. So I'm an optimist. Every community has a wealth of knowledge that can be used to address their particular needs and desires for a rape-free world. The rich tapestry, if you like, of public and private resistances that are open to each and every one of us are really inspiring. They are hope-inducing. So wherever we are situated as academics, homemakers, laborers, shopkeepers, secretaries, publishers, journalists, civil servants, teachers, students, entertainers, novelists, artists, lawyers, doctors, scientists, the unemployed, and so on, we can make a difference within our own contexts. Effective activism requires each of us to exploit our specific proclivities, our specific skills, and our specific spheres of influence. Intersectionality, which reminds us of difference, and transversalism, which provides ways of acting together while acknowledging difference, I think are powerful tools in moving towards the shared goal. Transversalism emphasizes the need to pay attention to interpersonal and intercommunal differences. It encourages uneasy coalitions, never mergers. The true enactment of solidarity requires reciprocal exchanges, focusing on political, economic, and social projects that will reduce or eradicate sexual violence. It is a task, I think, that will require the political, ideological, and cultural labor of every global citizen. But that is precisely why I am an optimist. That's what I wanted to say, but now I want to hear what you have to say about the way you are forging rape-free worlds, what you think works, what you think hasn't worked, ideas, anything at all. We've got about 20 minutes. Women in red. Always wanted to say that, women in red.
Hi. Hiya. That was really, really interesting. I'm curious to sort of unpick what you were saying about carceral solutions. So I'm a lawyer and I work with women who've been affected by sexual violence, and I completely agree with you that it's no deterrent, and often the justice system is horribly and brutalizing in its own way. However, I am struck by how women want justice, and they have a desire for the perpetrator to experience some consequence for what, the pain that has been inflicted on them. However, I agree with you that it's a racist system, and you can't exchange a sexist system to a racist system. I think that's all really interesting. What can we do in terms of actually addressing victims when they've been in that pain, and what's the appropriate way to do it within this framework?
Yeah, great. Can I get a glass of water? I mean, firstly, fantastic comment. Really, really appreciate that. It's really interesting. No feminist says, "Oh, I'm a carceral feminist." Everyone is a non-carceral. I mean, a carceral feminist is like a negative thing to call someone. That said, there is obviously a place for our justice systems. We need to think, I think, a lot more carefully about what that place is and how we negotiate it, given the fact that the prison system as we have it now is not effective, it's not doing its job, and it's making things perhaps a lot worse. And also, let's just be really brutal about it, it only affects like 3% of potential rapists anyway, so it's only really engaging with a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of those who commit these violent crimes. I think there are other ways, and lots of feminists are thinking exactly about what you're talking about. Well, okay, so we are anti-carceral. We don't think people should be just thrown into prison for 40 years or 30 years or whatever, but what else can we do? And there are other, and there's a massive literature on that, about other ways of dealing with with aggressive men, and treatment regimes, and other forms of distributive and justice, those sorts of things, which are really important. So I just wanted to say that and put it there for a second, because I also want to say that, draw your attention to the way I framed my arguments against carceral feminists, because I framed that argument in terms of, here's my background, given that, this is my view. I am quite prepared, I'm very prepared, in fact I do, have someone, particularly as you say, survivors who want to see the perpetrator, the person who did this, punished. I'm sitting next to them. We're united in our goal to change the world, to change what is happening. So, in other words, this comes back to the point I was trying to make, that, you know, we need to think, well, what are our priorities in this? And to put it crudely, the carceral feminists can have their arguments, I can have my arguments, but we need to come together in a coalition, and we need to think about what we can do as a goal-orientated aim together. And that's where I stand on this issue. Does that make sense? Anyone else? I hope I haven't bored everyone to tears. Yeah. Oh, hi.
Hi, Joan. While we're on this, just because it came up in the last session, we discussed restorative justice and what that means, because obviously that relates to some of the themes we talked about today, healing in particular. So it'd be quite good to hear your views about that. And
sorry, when I was a big district, I actually meant restorative.
Yeah, I thought you did. So.
I mean, restorative justice, from my perspective, is actually a really positive feminist response to, well, what do we do with people who are actually violent, and how can we do that? Now, I do see that there are problems with restorative justice. Restorative justice still, not everyone wants to, not all survivors want to be engaged in restorative justice systems for various reasons. They don't think it's punitive enough. They don't think it may sufficiently match the hugeness of what happened to them. There's also questioned about, well, what if someone who's committed such acts uses those systems? I mean, there are lots of issues with it, but I do think that of all of the more practical, urban-based models, it is one that is a really good one for us. And in fact, I do talk about restorative justice in the book as a model.
Thanks.
At the top there, woman in grey.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, obviously you mentioned that one good way of kind of tackling sexual violence and, you know, helping to hopefully create a rape-free world is obviously to kind of start with the main sort of demographic that that perpetrate, being largely cisgender males, and that's something I completely agree with. And I just wanted to kind of get your opinion on that, because I found that a lot of the time when it comes to sexual violence, because it's something that, you know, affects statistically more women than men, a lot of the time cisgender men can feel very almost like attacked a little bit, and you know, with the whole recent, with the whole recent, not all men hashtag that was trending and everything, I feel like it can automatically put cisgender men on like the back foot of, God, we're not all monsters, and then they can be a little bit, I don't know, maybe resistant to talk about it and sort of fight for it and kind of want to just kind of stay out of it. And I was just wondering if you could maybe talk about sort of how to approach that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a real problem. And certainly it's something that I've had to deal with quite a lot when I'm talking to various to groups, particularly groups of young men, because clearly, they don't want to be stigmatized by this, and also that, sexual violence harms masculinity, it harms men. It harms men in many different ways. It harms them because, 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted in their lifetime, but 1 in 6 men are. 1 in 6 men is not a small number. That means that all of us know a man who has, at some stage, been sexually assaulted, if it's 1 in 6. Okay? So, I think the message is to get this message across that sexual violence harms them, it harms their male friends, it harms their loved ones, it makes for a world that is so much more constrained than it need be. I mean, I have never had a conversation, literally never, and I'm an old woman, I've never had a conversation with a woman who says, oh, I feel fine going out at any time of the day, and I leave my door open, and I don't lock my door at night, and it constrains our lives, and therefore it makes our worlds so much thinner. So I think those are the language we ought to be using. I also think, and I blame myself here, because I've now given up using terms like toxic masculinity, because well, I'll tell you what my view is. Toxic masculinity isn't masculinity, it's just toxic. Masculinity is, my partner, my friends, this is the true masculinity. And putting that toxic in front of it somehow, I think, sends a bad message. And it also does make, again, particularly young men, at least those I talk to, and maybe I've just been talking to a lot of young men about this recently, it makes them scared to talk about it for fear that they'll say something wrong. I was talking to a young guy, 16, 17, I don't know, anyway, just a couple of weeks ago. And, he's got a heart of gold. And he's a loving, kind person, and he's really looking forward to being immersed in a loving, kind relationship. And yet his main thing was, I can't say anything because, what if I just use the wrong word by mistake? So I think also those are things we need to think about. But I do think things are moving forward. I mean, the session we had earlier today, I thought was really rich in the message it was getting across, and the ways men are able to talk about things like their emotions and sexual violence. So I actually do think that things are actually moving forward in that area faster than perhaps in other areas. But you were meant to be telling me about your ideas for a rape-free world. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yes, sorry, you've got the mic. I didn't see you.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I was just you mentioned earlier on that we see some different, in certain conflicts there's a lot of violence against women, and in others there isn't. Why is that? And could you maybe give some examples? And the second question I had is what are the differences between intersectionality and transversalism? What is the departure point?
Okay, yeah, great. Let's just take, my field of expertise, there is a lot of research on different levels of sexual violence between different conflicts, which shows this point, particularly in the context of African conflicts, and that's a really, really rich literature. That's not my field, but I can certainly send you the references. But let's look at my field, which is British and American conflicts, that we see if we look at conflicts in Britain and America. In some cases, units within the same contexts will act extremely violently, and others will act with zero sexual violence. And one of the questions I ask in a book I wrote called An Intimate History of Killing is, why do these different units in identical circumstances, so in other words, we can't say one is more brutalizing, or that, we can't differentiate the context because they're both fighting the same spaces. Why is it that one experiences high levels and one experiences 0 levels of sexual violence? And I think there are lots of different reasons for that, including issues of leadership and, incidentally, including issues of religion, which surprised me. I shouldn't say that, but it did surprise me. But I think that's one thing that we can look at. I think intersectionality is a way of understanding how there are layers of oppression, how they all interrelate with each other, okay? That's what transversalism does, is it says, well, given that, what can we do to forge bonds of solidarity? Okay, so so they are very tightly linked, but one is, okay, well, transversalism is celebrating the differences. And it's saying that the only way we can do that is to acknowledge difference and to work on a shared goal. So one is an operational aspect of intersectionality. I should have just said that. It would be just so much quicker if I just said that. Okay, one up there and then one down here. And then, by the way, we do have to leave because we have to leave at we have to finish literally just before past because we've got the last session and I'm speaking at it. Yes.
So I have a question for you, but also I just wanted to say that I think maybe what some of the stuff you said is really correct, that, empowering people how to make, become more comfortable with their bodies and make correct choices, like better choices for themselves and stuff, can help create a rape-free world. And also, instead of saying toxic masculinity, maybe educating people on what healthy masculinity is, because there is healthy masculinity as well. So those two things I think can be helpful. But I had a question, just because you touched on sort of the prisons and stuff like that earlier on in the talk, was, when I was living in Australia, there was a case where a guy had been in jail for rape and then I guess had good behavior, got let out within a week, had raped and murdered a woman. And and then, recently with Sarah Everard and all that kind of stuff. So what do you do once the act has already been committed and the person's already in the system? Like, what's the correct way to approach that? Because I think it's important as well, right?
Yeah. In this country, the prison system really needs relooking at in terms of how. So, what you're talking about here are extremes of violence perpetrated by men, solely by men. And I do think we need to think anew about how we manage those extreme offenders within the system in a way that is humane in some way. I know that's not a good answer. But I think we all struggle with, it's one thing to talk about a rapist who does it once, doesn't kill. We're talking about something different when we're talking about serial rape murderers. And one of the books actually I'm currently writing is a history of rape murder. And so I don't have an answer to that, except that we do need to, I think, to relook at our prison system. And even more so in the States with these mega prison systems, and where such a high proportion of men and minoritized women are in them. But I think you probably will have an answer to that. We got time for one more.
No, I don't have any questions, but you said you wanted ideas. I don't really have an idea, but the more I read and talk, the more I'm convinced that we need to include men, more and more. This whole debate, activism, needs to have male teachers, male therapists, male everything. because well, you know, I think the biggest success will be when they finally understand.
Yeah.
Well, there was one talk that I saw a few others. There was a trigger, about trigger, and there was one lady there saying that she had dinner with friends last night and mentioned about this guy who abused her. She didn't go into details. And on the way home on the tube, this guy walked in exactly the same line, exactly the same tube, exactly the same thing. And she said she just couldn't breathe. She couldn't. And she texted some friends who said to her, "Oh, what a coincidence." What? What sort of comment is that? Do you know what I mean? And I don't know. I think if men can listen to most of what we've debated here, it would be, I'd like to believe at least there will be a massive impact on the whole understanding.
And we have men in the audience who are actually actively engaged in precisely what you're talking about. And, you know, there are sensitive issues related to it because, you know, there's also a tendency for some men to take over. So getting that balance right, you know, yes, we need to involve them. Yes, they're here in this room. They're already engaged in these debates. And just, you know, providing a language and providing a way to do that and encouraging particularly younger men to get involved is, in my view, really, really crucial. Yes. Yeah, and I think one of the people involved in that was speaking earlier today. Yeah, Beyond Equality, which is a great, really, really great group. We've run out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for coming. Next session.